There are now lead-in times for products. There are shortages for vaccines. We've seen it time and time again. So being prepared, I'm going to buy in 200 store lambs. Well, I know I need 400 Clostridial vaccines to vaccinate the lambs twice. So have the vaccines in the fridge on the farm, so that when the animals hit the ground, you can hit the ground running and give them the treatments and safeguard the health of those animals.
Hello, I'm Kieran Lynch and welcome to OviCast, the Teagasc Sheep podcast. Each episode will bring in its insights, advice and technical updates for the sheep industry. Now, every time an animal enters or indeed re-enters a flock, it poses a risk of bringing unwanted health challenges with it. With sales season in full swing, we talk to Chief Specialist Michael Gottstein on how we can reduce this risk. We discuss what to look for before you buy, quarantine and parasite control plans, preventing lameness in new arrivals, and how you can use vaccination to protect your flock. It's a timely reminder for anyone buying stock this season. We hear now from Michael.
Yeah, look at, I suppose, any sheep coming onto the farm. So I suppose whether that's a sheep that's borrowed, that wanders in from somewhere else, a sheep that's been out grazing on maybe another farm somewhere and comes back to your own farm, or something that you buy. So whether that's a store lamb, a ram, a bunch of females, breeding females or whatever. I suppose the thing is that every time an animal comes onto the farm like that, there's the risk that with it comes a disease or a nasty boger or parasite that you haven't already got on your farm. And that's what we often talk about quarantine. And very often people, kind of view quarantine as being something you buy in, but it's not necessarily buying in. It could be just, animals that went to local show or went to the mart and weren't sold or brought home, or animals that are out on another farm for grazing, temporary grazing. Anytime they come back onto the farm, I suppose there's that risk that, they came in contact with a bug or picked up a parasite that you don't have on your farm, or a resistant parasite to a particular drug, which, again, you don't have on your farm. And I suppose when we're talking about quarantine treatment, we're talking about what are the steps that the farmer can take to prevent, in as far as is possible or as far as is practically possible, those new bugs or parasites coming onto the farm.
Mike, I think it's fair to say that we probably underestimate the importance of putting in a bit of effort when those animals come onto the farm. It can often be easy that it's a job of dropping the ramp and letting them off out into the field. But as you said there is the potential of bringing in a new health risk that we mightn't actually realise for a year or two later.
So by and large, most of the things that come in animals, these kind of nasties, we'll call them, that we don't want, it takes us quite a while to figure out that they've arrived, on most farms. And look, at some of them we can do bits about, and some of them we probably can't. There are everything from resistant parasites. So these are parasites that, like worms and fluke, for example, that come onto your farm that are different strains in some cases. So things like Homunculus or Barber's poleworm, you mightn't have that on your farm. You bring it onto the farm, now it's a new parasite. Or parasites that are resistant. So these are worms that basically are resistant to the wormers. And maybe, have a different resistance profile to the parasites that are on your farm. Then there's things like lameness, and then diseases, like, some of these aborting diseases like enzootic abortion. Some of them ones that we call iceberg diseases, the more long-term diseases. They're slow, insidious, develop over time, are very destructive in a flock. Things like Iones, Scrapie, Yaxete, CLA, those kind of diseases that you probably only see them 2 or 3 years after you buy them in, and at that stage they've kind of made their way into the flock, and it can be very expensive to control them and get rid of them.
Michael, of those you mentioned, some of them we can mitigate some of that risk. Others obviously is a longer term thing that's more difficult. Maybe we approach it from a kind of couple of basic steps in terms of the first couple of things we need to look at when either purchasing or when that animal arrives on the farm. So suppose we took it from the point of view of when we're going out to buy stock coming in, or maybe to take back stock. What do we need to pay attention to?
Yeah. So I suppose look at the purists, and if we look at the people where biosecurity and quarantining and all that is really, really important in the pig and poultry world. The first thing they try to do is avoid it in as much as is possible, so limit the amount of animals that we buy or the movements. And that's I suppose the best advice, But okay, look at there'll be people there that you need to buy a ram, you need to buy some females. I suppose asking the questions, talk to the people selling the sheep, you know, ask them, do they have these conditions? Have that conversation at least. And look at, maybe they don't know that they have them, but I mean, certainly if they do know them, they have some of these things, it'd be hard for them to say, yeah, they don't. And then I suppose the next thing is when we bring the sheep in, are they healthy? Like, are we bringing in healthy sheep, or is there, and in particular, I suppose, Kieran, when we see, times like this when stock are very, very expensive, and we've seen a big increase in the price of both cattle and sheep over the last a year or so, and then maybe poor stock sometimes looks good value, but poor stock often can be the most expensive stock you buy, if in particular if they're poor because they have underlying health conditions. So the first step, I suppose, is try and ask the questions, buy healthy looking stock, with no obvious signs of ill health. Check them for diseases, lumps and bumps, lameness, those type of things. CLA, for example, is one of these iceberg diseases where we often see lumps around the neck, under the ears. So those could be signs of CLA. No, look, it could be just a thorn infection as well, but I mean, the day you buy, I suppose, check for things like that. Um, when the animals come on the farm, then very important that we keep them separate from our own animals, until, for as long as possible, as long as it's practically possible. Um, and that's the quarantining procedure. That's basically where you bring the sheep onto the farm and you quarantine them.
So, Michael, like, I think you're 100% right, is checking the basics. And I take that point about poor stock can often be the problematic ones. When those animals come on the farm, though, what are the first couple of things we need to do with those before we consider introduce them to the rest of the flock?
Yep. So we want to keep them separate. And for as long as possible, as is practically possible, okay? And that probably means buying animals in time, so buying your replacement rams or your replacement breeding females, you know, ideally 2 months before you need them, so that you have as much time as possible to quarantine them and get them acclimatized to the new farm. Um, so we keep them separate for the first 48 hours. We want to house them. Um, and that's when we do our parasite cleanouts. Okay, so the first 48 hours, when we bring the sheep onto the farm, we put them into a shed, um, and we treat them. We treat them to try and eliminate any parasites that they have. So when we talk about parasites, we're talking about internal parasites. So those are things like stomach worms. If it's a fluke-prone farm, we could be looking at liver fluke as well. Um, and then external parasites, so things like sheep scab and lice. Okay, so we want to try and get rid of as much of what they're carrying or could potentially carrying. And in particular, I suppose as well, Kieran, if we have sheep coming in from marts, uh, putting in place maybe a fly strike control as well, because they'll have got dirty inside in the marts from the transport and from sheep jumping on each other, and they'll have a lot of fecal matter, and just making sure that when we let them out, I suppose afterwards, that they don't all get fly strike this time of the year. Yeah.
So, Michael, in terms of the internal parasites, and you mentioned resistant worms is a potential risk, Humongous is a potential risk, possibly even fluke. In terms of putting in a comprehensive program, what do we need to be targeting there?
Yep. So I suppose the way because we won't know the resistance status of the parasites in these sheep that we're bringing onto the farm, or it's highly unlikely that we're going to know what the resistance status is. What we try to do then is a kind of a catch-all approach. Like so, the ideal situation is where we use a fourth or fifth generation. So for most people, that's going to be Zolvex in Ireland at the moment. That's the only one that's readily available. So a Zolvex, which is the fourth generation new type wormer, it's a quite an expensive wormer. It needs to be ordered in time. It's unlikely that your vet will have it in stock. No, they may do, but by and large, it probably has to be got in. Um, so we give that warmer because we know there's very low levels of resistance to that particular product. We haven't identified any resistance to that product in Ireland at this stage. So we're going to treat them with Zolvex and a second warmer as well, just in case that there was some few parasites, some few worms inside there that were resistant to the Zolvex. And generally, the product of choice there with Zolvex would be either levamisole or a macrocyclic lactone, so one of the clear warmers. Okay. And if it's a small number of sheep, like a ram that's coming in, um, very often we give the second warmer as an injectable to treat against scab. So using something like Dectamax or Cydectin injectable, which is they're kind of the longer acting ivermectin products that have, a one-shot efficacy against sheep scab. And that is the reason for that is just from a practical point of view, it's unlikely that we're going to fill a dipping tank to dip one sheep. Okay. Now, if we're buying in 50 Pagadios or 50 lambs, different story. We should probably consider plunge dipping because it's a better job in terms of controlling external parasite. It's going to do a job for us in terms of controlling lice as well. It's going to do a job for us in terms of giving us some blowfly protection after the animals have gone through a mart or transport or all of that type of thing. So it kills multiple or it ticks multiple boxes for us. So for bigger numbers, I would be advocating filling the dipping tank or getting in a mobile plunge dipper to do them. I know it's expensive, um, but in terms of getting very good control on the externals, it's the best option. Okay, for the worms, we're talking about two wormers given sequentially at the same time, one after the other, and the animals kept in for 48 hours to allow any eggs that have been laid by um, anthelmintic resistant parasites to pass through. For fluke, it's a little bit more or difficult because the flukicides don't kill all of the parasites, so the flukicides have different actions in terms of the age at which they kill the parasites. So on farms where we are worried about fluke, again, we would be talking about giving two different fluke products sequentially. So not mixing them, giving them sequentially to the animals, and then turning them out onto dry ground that has been grazed by sheep. So that's what we're recommending from a internal parasite point of view. From the externals, I suppose we've talked about the dipping is the best option, where you've got a number of sheep. Where you don't have a number of sheep, then using an injectable macrocyclic lactone, which we generally don't recommend, but for an individual animal or one or two animals, is probably the most practical solution. Um, Followed by also maybe a pour-on for blowfly and also probably a pour-on for biting lice or something like that because we don't want to bring that into the farm if we don't have an issue with that as well. So
Okay.
if we're talking about those for small numbers of animals for the external parasites, it's again it's a number of products to make
And
sure that
Mike,
we're getting all of them.
and Michael, like that might sound a lot of treatments, but when you work it out over time, it's not actually it's a safe policy. And again, that's something that should be done the minute the ramp is dropped into the yard and treated straight away, and then that quarantine for 48 hours. You also mentioned lameness. Like, how do we, apart from spotting the obvious one that is lame, how do we address some of those issues?
Yeah, ideally we should be foot bathing them. So foot bathing is a very good way of in for non-clinically lame sheep is a very good way of eliminating bugs that are on their feet because it has disinfectant quality. So a long foot bathing is what's really wanted here. If there are lame sheep there, I'd be saying don't buy them in the first place if you can avoid that. Now look at, nobody's perfect, and maybe a batch of sheep looked perfectly good in the mart, and they come home, and 2 days later there's a couple of them lame. Inspect them to see what they have. What's causing that lameness? If you're not sure, talk to your vet. Um, we have seen a number of farms over the years, Kieran, bringing CODD, which is contagious ovine digital dermatitis, onto their farm. Very difficult to treat once it gets there. Really infectious, runs through the flock, very expensive to treat. Um, and that's the one we really want to avoid. If you don't have it on your farm, you do not want to be buying in sheep with CODD. So this is where the quarantine procedure really comes into play. The longer you can keep the sheep away from your sheep, if something like this arises that we see after a week or 10 days, some of these sheep getting lame and we realize they have CODD, well, if we have still those sheep separated in a separate paddock on their own, we're only talking about treating and dealing with the population of sheep that we've brought onto the farm. So that might be a ram or two, or it might be a handful of ewe lambs or hockets. Okay. If we've left them off in with the rest of our sheep, well, now we have the whole flock. It's after going through the whole flock. So in general, where possible, we recommend that, you know, in an ideal situation, and again, it's not always practical, but where it's possible to keep the sheep away from your own sheep for 3 to 4 weeks to see is there anything like that developing, an outbreak of scab, an out that you didn't get with the injectable, an outbreak of CODD or something, and that you've confined it to that batch of sheep, and it's much easier and cheaper to treat it and deal with it and try and eliminate it before it spreads through the entire flock on your farm.
I'm thinking there, Michael, in terms of running through that footpath, anyone that has done it with sheep will know the ones that are showing some signs of lameness will yield more after the footpath. It could be a case of even keeping them couple isolated until you have that clear up as well. So it's a very useful step in that process.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we've come across flocks where they've bought a couple of ewe lambs in and they've brought in the CODD and it's been very expensive. It's been expensive and difficult to treat once it gets into the flock.
One other you mentioned there, and this is more related to breeding females, is some of those abortive agents you could potentially bring in. Some of them, Michael, we can vaccinate for. Michael should discuss that a little bit, but just in the broader terms of vaccination, we also have to consider covering these animals for diseases that might be present or high risk on the farm as well. So, how important is vaccination in that whole
Yep.
process?
So look, at vaccines are I suppose a way of protecting the flock, and I suppose when we talk about a vaccination, the main one from a sheep to sheep point of view would be enzootic abortion. Um, so that's the one that you buy in. It's a very, very nasty disease insofar as that, it starts with a small number of abortions. The animals that are aborting are infected. They shed a huge amount of the bug after lambing and infect lots of other sheep. And over a period of time, the number of abortions increase until you get an abortion storm. And when you reach that stage where 20 or 30% of the ewes are aborting, it's a horrendous situation for the farmer. From every point of view, from an animal point of view, from a human labor stress, having to deal with sick and dying sheep, and it's not where we want to be. So really, I suppose, um, again, go back to my earlier comment, the safest way is not to be buying anything in. It's generally a female that will be bringing that in. That can be a pet lamb, a foster ewe, batch of ewe lambs you buy, a batch of hoggets, a batch of yours in a mart or farm to farm. So my advice to people would be if you are buying in and if your policy is to buy in breeding females, um, vaccination would be advised for enzootic abortion. Would advise advocate to everybody who's buying in breeding females from unknown sources, um, that they should be vaccinating for enzootic abortion because simply the cost of the vaccine is relatively too small when we take into account the pain, hardship, misery, and suffering that happens on these farms when we get an abortion outbreak. and it's pinned down to enzootic abortion. And the cost at that stage to get on top of that is huge in terms of antibiotics, in terms of labor, in terms of losses, and in terms of vaccination. So, really, I suppose my advice to people is if you're buying in breeding females, you should be vaccinating for enzootic abortion.
And Michael, just for
Um,
clarity, that's the whole flock would have to be done in the first year, and then just subsequently it'll be the
Absolutely,
new
whatever
lambs or the hybrids.
replacements are
Yeah.
coming in, yeah, yeah. If I suppose the other one then that you talked about is the vaccination for most people in the sheep world. The ones that we'd be vaccinating for would be clostridial diseases and pasteurella pneumonia. So if your farm is a risk farm in terms of clostridial disease and pasteurella pneumonia, and you're habitually vaccinating animals for those conditions, then it is wise, I suppose, when you're bringing animals onto the farm that you vaccinate those as well. And that's a two-shot process, 4 to 6 weeks apart. So when they're coming onto the farm, they get the first shot, and 4 to 6 weeks later, they get a follow-on booster shot. I wouldn't um, be at all concerned or pay any heed to what the previous owners have done in terms of vaccination. I take control of it myself in that situation because, in particular with vaccines, very important with vaccines is the handling of the vaccine between purchase and use. Has it been administered properly? Given with clean needles and aseptic conditions, all that type of thing. So assume that whatever you're buying hasn't been vaccinated and give it the full course of vaccines when you bring it onto your farm, so that those animals are protected and you don't end up going out a week or two later and finding dead sheep around the field. One dead sheep will pay for an awful lot of vaccine with the current sheep prices. So generally, these Pasteurella and Clostridial vaccines are really good value in terms of the bang for buck they give in protecting animals for the cost.
Okay, it's a good investment. Michael, I'll swing you back to where we started in a moment. Like we went through a lot of different treatments we can implement, and all of those from a cost point of view, if you sit down and work it out, it does more than balance outweigh the risk of what you could bring in. But you started off with doing the very basics of checking the flock health, and I suppose you talked there about keeping them separate for longer. That basic husbandry practice of checking for animals with ill thrift or checking for any signs of that, that's still probably the most basic important thing to do over the next couple of months. Like it's already keeping them animals separate, but unless we actually check for issues, it's a kind of a waste of a process.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, the reason why we're keeping them separate is to allow things to develop so that we can treat them before we introduce them into the flock, the main flock, we'll say, or the home flock. So the critical part here is that they're checked and that, if things start to arise. So if we do see, animals itching, for example, that we can say, okay, look at maybe the scab that is on those or the lice are resistant to the product we've used, and we need to use a different before we introduce them into with the rest of the animals. Because they're going to infect the other animals if that happens. The same with the lameness. Maybe we've treated them for lameness, but the treatment wasn't effective. There was some bugs that have escaped the treatment in the foot bathing, and now they have CODD. Again, we need to get on top of that, make sure we've eliminated all of the CODD in the flock before we introduce them to our own flock of sheep. Same with foot rot. If they have foot rot is very contagious. If we've spent a lot of time controlling lameness on the home flock and we've managed to get it under control, the last thing we want to do is introduce infected animals back into that home flock that are going to, explode the level of lameness that we have in the home flock. So really, the quarantine period th- is the longer it is, the better. Um, And the important thing, I suppose, is that we're really checking and treating anything that's arising, and really important, I suppose, when you see lame sheep or you see sheep itching or any of these kind of things, that you try to identify what's causing it, and then treat the cause of the symptom and
Very,
eliminate it.
very final thing, Michael, and this is a wee bit like when we chat about prepping for lab and having our supplies on hand. when we're prepping for buying in stock, there is a little bit of preparation required there, whether it be a bit of feed to keep them in for them 48 hours, but more importantly, that dosing we need. Do we need to think about the vaccination program? And that's a good chance to talk to the vet as well about that. But and have our foot bath set up. Like there is a wee bit of equipment needed, a wee bit of consumables needed, and there's a wee bit of time needed to go into that before the animals land on the farm, rather than having to scramble in the following week and maybe realise we can't get some of this stuff.
Absolutely, yeah. You need to have a shed ready for them. If they're staying in for 48 hours, which is the minimum that we'd be recommending they should be staying in for at least 48 hours. You need to probably have some hay available for them, a little bit of meal, maybe if they're rams that have or breeding stock that have been fed, have a little bit of meal to bring them down slowly. So that means having the sheds cleaned out, and and some farms maybe that hasn't arisen yet, or maybe there's machinery inside in the sheep sheds or grain or stuff, so it's having a pen available for them so that we don't have to chuck them out into a field, which we want to avoid doing, having the footbath, as you said, ready. But more importantly, when we bring the sheep onto the farm for the first 48 hours where we want to house them, that 48 hours, that requires that we dose them when they're coming off the trailer. Now, if the dose isn't available, then the 48 hours has to be extended, so we need to make sure that we have, in particular, the ones that will be difficult to get will be for the females, the enzootic abortion vaccine. That's something that needs to be planned in advance and ordered. That's not something you can buy off the shelf in most cases. And the same with the Zolvex, this fourth generation wormer. That's going to have to be ordered in most cases. Look, there might be the odd vet that's stocking a half a litre of that or something, but by and large, they are ordered to use, so the vet will order them when there's demand for it. So having a conversation with your veterinary surgeon a couple of weeks before you're going buying stock or bringing stock onto the farm is probably wise, so that it allows them time to source the different products from the wholesalers. Look, what we've seen since COVID, Kieran, that the supply chains for medicines, for all medicines, human medicines and animal medicines, have been somewhat upended, and it's not just as easy as it used to be years ago, where you could go into the co-op or the merchant or your vet and the stuff would be on the shelf. There are now lead-in times for products. There are shortages for vaccines. We've seen it time and time again. So being prepared, I'm going to buy in 200 store lambs. Well, I know I need 400 clostridial vaccines. If that's what I'm going to do, if I'm going to dose to vaccinate the lambs twice. So have the vaccines in the fridge on the farm, so that when the animals hit the ground, you can hit the ground running and go in and give them the treatments and safeguard the health of those animals.
Mike, good having you on. Thanks for that update. It's certainly something that needs to be put in place on farms at the moment.
No bother. Thanks for having me on.
We'll leave it there for this week's episode. I'd like to thank Michael again for coming on with us and sharing some useful insights to anyone that's bringing in stock onto the farm this season. That's it for me. For updates on my sheep programme, keep an eye on our Twitter page at Teagasc Sheep. I'm Kieran Lynch. Thanks for joining us. Don't forget to subscribe and follow us for more episodes.